Prescott Elementary, the atmosphere was thick with excitement as the students prepared for Career Week. It was that special time of year when parents came in to share what they did for a living, each bringing something unique, stethoscopes, hard hats, or even laptops, to show off their professions. The kids sat cross-legged on the reading rug, eagerly waiting for their turn. Some beamed with pride, their eyes alight with the stories they were about to tell, while others shrank into themselves, unsure of what to share. It was a day that broke up the usual routine of spelling tests and multiplication tables, and everyone looked forward to it. Among the students, 8-year-old Jalen Brooks was practically buzzing with energy. Small for his age but as sharp as a tack, Jalen had a way of speaking that made you believe every word mattered. He was excited because today was the day he would get to tell everyone about his dad. His father, Dr. Kelvin Brooks, worked at NASA, a fact that Jalen was incredibly proud of. And as his dad was supposed to come later that afternoon, he couldn't wait to share it with his classmates. When Mr. Denton, the teacher, asked the class to go around and share what their parents did for work, Jalen sat up straight in his seat, his chest puffed out with pride. He'd been rehearsing for days. "My dad," he said, "works at NASA." There was a pause in the room. It wasn't the kind of pause that suggested confusion. No, it was the kind of pause that indicated doubt. One kid snickered, another muttered under his breath, "Yeah, right." But it was Mr. Denton's reaction that hit the hardest. The teacher, in his early 40s with thinning hair and khakis tucked into his polo shirt, chuckled. It wasn't a belly laugh. It wasn't even a laugh of genuine amusement. It was a low, dismissive chuckle, the kind that makes you feel smaller than you already are. He raised an eyebrow and said, "NASA, huh? That's quite the imagination, Jalen. Maybe next time we go for something more realistic." The room seemed to echo with the laughter of the other kids. One girl even whispered under her breath, "More realistic," as though they were all in on the joke. But Jalen wasn't laughing. His shoulders slumped, and the words that had been full of pride moments ago suddenly felt empty. He didn't speak another word. His sneakers tapped together nervously as he stared down at the rug. His hands, which had been so animated just moments before now, curled into tight fists in his lap. Mr. Denton didn't notice. He moved on, continuing with the day's lessons without pausing to see how deeply his words had hurt Jalen. But one person did notice. Mila and Gwen, who sat beside Jalen, leaned in. "I believe you," they whispered, their voices soft and supportive. Jalen didn't respond. He just nodded slightly, his eyes still fixed on the floor, as though he was trying to disappear into the carpet beneath him. The rest of the morning passed by in a blur for Jalen. Jacob's dad was a firefighter, Chloe's mom ran a bakery, and the parents clapped, cheered, and gave hugs. Jalen just sat there, trying to become invisible. At lunch, he barely touched his sandwich. He didn't join in when the other boys started making silly dances by the vending machines. Normally, he'd be racing for the swings, laughing and shouting with his friends, but today felt different. That moment, the laugh, the doubt, stuck with him. It wasn't just the ridicule, but how easily it had come. A grown man, someone meant to encourage him, had dismissed him without a second thought. It hurt, but what Mr. Denton didn't know was that Jalen wasn't making it up. His dad really did work at NASA. He wasn't exaggerating or fantasizing. Dr. Kelvin Brooks was an aerospace engineer, and he'd been working on a Mars communications relay project for the past year. Every day, he wore his NASA badge with pride, and Jalen wore his own version of that pride. But in that classroom, none of it mattered to Mr. Denton. To him, the idea of someone like Jalen's dad, someone who worked at NASA, just didn't seem possible. It was too much for him to believe. But as fate would have it, the day wasn't over yet. Someone was about to walk into that classroom who would change everything. 3 days before Career Week, Jalen had been in the garage with his dad, helping him clean out bins filled with old cables and wires. Well, mostly just watching as his dad worked. Jalin, ever curious, had a question ready every few minutes. "Wait, so the rover has to wait how long to send a message back to Earth?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Dr. Kelvin Brooks, deep in the tangle of wiring, didn't even look up. "Depending on where Mars is in orbit, anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes. Jalin's face lit up with realization. "So it's like texting with really bad service?" His dad laughed. "Exactly. Space has terrible Wi-Fi." Those were the moments Jalin cherished. No grand lectures, no complicated explanations, just small, simple moments where his dad explained the complex in a way that made sense. It wasn't just about the science. It was about the connection, the shared time that made even difficult things feel easy. Dr. Brooks was the kind of man who could make an entire room stop when he walked in. He had that presence, but at home, he was calm, soft-spoken, always willing to break down complicated concepts so that even an 8-year-old could understand. Jalin's favorite time was when they would spend hours in the garage, with his dad explaining the wonders of space in the most casual way. One evening, Jalin brought a NASA folder from his dad's desk into his room, laying it on his bed like it was treasure. "Can I show them this at school?" he asked, his eyes full of hope. Dr. Brooks looked at the folder and smiled. "I don't think I'm allowed to bring classified stuff to show and tell, buddy. Not even one little page." But that didn't matter. It wasn't about showing off or impressing anyone. It was about sharing a piece of his world, his father's world, with the kids at school. And though Jalin's pride had been crushed earlier, the truth about his dad, about who he was and what he did, was about to walk into that classroom and change everything. Kelvin Brooks sat down beside Jalin and placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder. "You don't need the folder," he said softly. "All you need is your voice. Just tell them what I do and tell them you're proud." Jalin hesitated, his nerves creeping up despite his earlier confidence. "What if they don't believe me?" he asked, his voice small. Kelvin leaned back, supporting himself on one elbow, his voice steady. "Then that's their problem, not yours." He paused for a moment, making sure his son was listening. "But what if they laugh?" Kelvin's expression didn't change. He wasn't one to sugarcoat things, especially not when it came to preparing Jalin for the world. He knew the harshness of it, knew what it was like for young boys, especially boys who looked like his son. "If they laugh," he said, "you keep your head up and remember that the truth doesn't need applause. It just needs to be said." Jalin nodded slowly. He didn't fully grasp what his dad meant, but he trusted him. He trusted that the words coming from his dad's mouth carried weight. That night, Jalin sat down in his room and scribbled down everything he wanted to say during career week. Words like orbit, spacecraft, and Mars relay filled the page, written in large bubble letters. He even drew a picture of his dad, holding Earth in one hand and a satellite in the other. It was his way of showing his classmates who his dad really was. The next morning, Jalin practiced in front of the bathroom mirror, pointing like his dad did when explaining how things worked. He even threw in a joke about space Wi-Fi, one his dad often told to make space feel a little less distant, a little more relatable. He couldn't wait to tell his class, but that wasn't how things went. When Mr. Denton laughed at Jalin's words the day before, it cut deep. And when lunchtime came and went, Jalin didn't tell anyone about his dad's work, about NASA. Instead, he crumpled up the picture he'd drawn and shoved it into the bottom of his backpack. It was strange how quickly excitement could transform into embarrassment. One moment, you're at the top of the world, and the next, you're counting the minutes until you can go home and forget it all happened. Kelvin had been in back-to-back meetings that morning, preparing a kid-friendly slideshow for the class. He was excited to share something fun, a presentation with cartoons of rockets, pictures of Mars, and plenty of bright colors. But his favorite slide was the last one, It showed him and Jalen at the NASA Jet Propulsion Lab, both wearing matching badges, grinning ear to ear. Kelvin didn't know what was happening at Prescott Elementary. He didn't know that his son was sitting quietly, his heart heavy with doubt. Back in class, Jalen wasn't grinning anymore. He wasn't upset either. He wasn't pouting or crying. He just went quiet, like something inside him had shut off for the day. Mila noticed. So did a few other kids, but nobody said anything. The career presentations were scheduled for the last hour of the day. Mr. Denton started lining up the desks in rows, moving the whiteboard easel to the front. Parents were to wait outside the classroom and be called in one by one. Jalen watched the clock more than the presentations. First came Chloe's mom, who brought in cupcakes and passed around cookies in the shape of business cards from her bakery. Then came Thomas's uncle, a mechanic, who showed the class a tire pressure gauge like it was treasure. Kids clapped, laughed, asked questions, and Jalen just sat there, palms sweaty, knees bouncing, praying his dad would show up. What if Mr. Denton had been right? What if Jalen's dad wasn't who he thought he was? What if he didn't show up at all? The thoughts came, and Jalen tried to shake them away, but doubt had already crept in. That ugly, silent doubt that didn't ask questions. It just whispered things that hurt. Mr. Denton, meanwhile, was standing near the door, clipboard in hand, occasionally stepping out to call in the next parent. He was back in his element now, cracking jokes and leading the room through the usual routine. But every now and then, his eyes flicked to Jalen, who didn't look back. Maybe Mr. Denton realized he had gone too far. Maybe it hit him when he saw how Jalen had shut down after that comment. But he didn't apologize, not then. Instead, he just kept the show moving. As 1:30 approached, Jalen checked the door over and over, hoping to see his dad's silhouette, the tie, the suit jacket. He imagined it like a movie in his head, but now he wasn't so sure how it would end. "All right, Mr. Denton said, glancing at his list. "Up next, we have..." He stopped mid-sentence because the door had already opened, and there he was. Dr. Kelvin Brooks stepped into the room, dressed in a navy blue blazer, a white shirt and slacks, with that familiar NASA badge clipped just below his breast pocket. His hair was trimmed close, peppered with gray at the temples. He scanned the room once, and then his eyes landed on Jalen. Jalen sat up so fast that his chair scraped against the tile. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Kelvin gave a slight nod, no big smiles, just a calm, steady presence. "Hello?" Dr. Brooks said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm Dr. Brooks. I design spacecraft." And just like that, the room froze. Not with laughter, not with confusion, but with realization. The doubt that had been hanging over Jalen was gone in an instant, and the truth stood there, solid and unshakable. It was one moment, one man, one truth, and for everyone in that room, everything had just changed. Mr. Denton wasn't ready to process what had just happened, and now, standing at the front of the classroom holding a clipboard he suddenly didn't want, he realized he didn't know what to do. When Dr. Kelvin Brooks walked in, the room didn't explode into applause or gasps. No one said a word. The silence, however, was deafening. It wasn't the kind of quiet that made you uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that made you realize something important was happening. Kelvin didn't need props or flashy visuals to make an impact. He only needed his voice, his presence, his badge, and the fact that he existed in a space where most of these kids, and certainly Mr. Denton, didn't expect him to be. The truth of it hung in the air, unspoken, yet clear. Mr. Denton blinked, his lips parting as though he were about to speak, but couldn't quite find the words. Jalen, still staring, his eyes wide with disbelief, was caught in a moment that he didn't quite understand. Truth be told, part of him had started to believe his dad wouldn't show up. Not because he thought his dad didn't care, but because when someone important doubts you, it messes with your head, especially when you're a kid. But But here was his dad, not just on time, but early, waiting just outside the door. He had heard every word from the hallway, heard the ridicule, heard the doubt, and yet he stepped in with nothing but calm, steady confidence. He walked to the front of the room slowly, deliberately, as if he wasn't in a rush to prove anything. When he reached the front, he gave Mr. Denton a polite nod, cool, measured. Then he turned to face the class. "So," he said, his voice calm, "you guys learning about jobs today?" A kid raised his hand, his curiosity piqued. "Do you fly rockets?" Kelvin chuckled. "Not quite. I help build the systems that allow rockets to talk to us after they leave Earth. Think of it like this. Spacecraft need phones, and we build the phones." Another hand shot up. "Like space iPhones?" Kelvin grinned. "Sure, but with really bad reception." That got a laugh from the class. Even Jalen smiled for the first time that day. Kelvin clicked a button on the screen and showed a photo of the Mars Relay Project, a series of satellites orbiting in deep space. Another photo appeared, showing him in front of a large control panel, his face lit with the quiet pride of someone who knew he was doing something that mattered. "What you're looking at," Kelvin explained, "is part of how we stay connected to robots on another planet. We make sure they can call home." One by one, the kids leaned in, captivated by the pictures and the explanation. All except Mr. Denton, who stood off to the side, silent for once. His eyes darted between the screen, Kelvin, and then to Jalen, who now sat up straighter than he had all day. Kelvin didn't make it personal. He didn't say anything about what had happened earlier. He didn't need to. His presence alone had already conveyed more than enough. But just before wrapping up, he paused and looked directly at the class. "By the way," he said, his voice steady and calm, "I heard someone earlier say that working at NASA might be unrealistic." He let the word unrealistic hang in the air just long enough. Then he turned to Jalen and continued, "I guess some people have a different definition of realistic." And with that, he smiled. For the first time all day, Jalen beamed. His fists, which had been clenched with anxiety, finally unclenched. He looked around the room and noticed the shift. The smirks from earlier were gone. Now there were wide eyes, nods, and maybe even a few sparks of admiration. Even Milo whispered, "Told you so." Mr. Denton cleared his throat. "Thank you, Dr. Brooks. That was informative." Kelvin gave a short nod and glanced at the clock. "I've got to head back. Mars doesn't like to be kept waiting." A few kids laughed again as he walked past Mr. Denton toward the door. Just before stepping out, he paused for half a second, his voice dropping to a quieter tone. "I hope your students always feel heard," he said softly, "especially the ones who dream big." And with that, he was gone. But the tension he left behind stayed. It lingered in the room, thick and palpable, and now it was up to Mr. Denton to figure out what to do with it. For a full beat after Dr. Brooks walked out, Mr. Denton stood frozen, one hand still gripping his clipboard, the other dangling by his side like he didn't know where to put it anymore. He turned back to the class, but the usual control he had over the room was gone. The kids weren't looking at him. They were looking at Jalen. And Jalen? He was glowing, not in a loud or smug way, but quietly, sitting there with his shoulders relaxed and his chin up, like someone who had finally been seen the way they deserved to be. "All right, Mr. Denton said, his voice thinner than usual. "Let's thank Dr. Brooks for coming." But the applause didn't feel like it used to. It wasn't for Mr. Denton, and it wasn't for the lesson. It was for Jalen, who had been given the space to show everyone who he really was, and to finally believe it himself. A few kids clapped, but it was more out of politeness than real enthusiasm. Mila was the first to follow. A few others joined in, but Mr. Denton, struggling to regain control, tried to move on like nothing had happened. He started to introduce the next parent, but his voice faltered, a hesitation that made it clear he knew that no matter what he said now, it would fall flat. No one was paying attention to tire gauges or cupcakes anymore. Everyone had just witnessed a man walk in who shattered every assumption that had been hanging in that classroom all year. After the final presentation, Mr. Denton dismissed the class. Backpacks zipped, chairs scraped against the tile, the usual end-of-day noise filled the room. But Jalin didn't move. He just sat there, hands folded neatly, waiting. Most of the kids had already filed out, and the hallway noise was beginning to swell when Mr. Denton walked over to Jalin's desk. He stood there, shifting his weight between his feet, clearly unsure of what to say. "Hey," he started, almost too casually. "Your dad seems like a pretty smart guy." Jalin looked up slowly, meeting Mr. Denton's eyes. "He is." Mr. Denton nodded, trying to find his words. "I can see that. I wanted to say I may have jumped the gun earlier." Jalin didn't respond. Mr. Denton cleared his throat, fumbling with his words. "What I meant to say is, sometimes teachers, people, make mistakes. We don't always realize when something we say comes out wrong." Jalin stared at him for a moment, then said simply, "But you laughed." That hit Mr. Denton hard. His face tightened, and for a moment, he just stood there, at a loss. "Yeah," he admitted, his voice soft. "I did, and I'm sorry for that. It wasn't right. I should have listened." Jalin still didn't nod, didn't give him any easy way out. Mr. Denton sighed, finally saying, "I hope you'll give me a chance to do better." Jalin stood up slowly, slinging his backpack over one shoulder and walking toward the door. Just before he left, he turned his head, looking back at Mr. Denton and said, "It wasn't your imagination. That's really my dad." And with that, he walked out of the room. Mr. Denton stood there for a beat, one hand still resting on the empty desk, the other shoved in his pocket. The hallway noise outside faded as the classroom emptied, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. It wasn't just the words that mattered. It was the realization of what could have happened. How easily Jalin's belief in himself, his family, and his own voice could have been shattered. And now, Mr. Denton couldn't stop hearing the echo of his own words. Maybe next time, we aim for something more realistic. It wasn't just a careless comment. It was a boundary he had tried to place on a child's imagination, and it had backfired. That evening, as the Arizona sun dipped below the rooftops, painting the sky orange and pink, Jalin sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, dinner by choice. Kelvin leaned against the counter, sipping from a chipped mug that read "Space Nerd" in faded blue letters. Neither of them spoke much at first. It wasn't awkward, just a quiet moment. Then Jalin looked up at his dad. "Did you hear him?" Jalin asked. Kelvin raised an eyebrow. "Your teacher?" Jalin nodded. "When I said you worked at NASA, he laughed like it was a joke." Kelvin didn't answer right away. He set his mug down, walked over, and sat across from Jalin. "Yeah," he said finally. "I heard." Jalin frowned. "Why do people do that?" Kelvin's voice was low now. "Because sometimes they see the world in a small box, and when something doesn't fit inside it, they laugh. It's not always hate. Sometimes it's just ignorance. But either way, it's not your job to shrink for them." Jalin stirred his cereal slowly, his mind running over the day. "I didn't feel smart anymore." Kelvin leaned in, serious now. "Don't let someone else's doubt erase your truth. You know who you are. You know who I am. That's what matters." Jalin nodded, just a little, feeling a bit of the weight lift. "You did good today," Kelvin added. "You told the truth. You held your ground. That's brave." Jalin gave a small smile. The next morning at school, something was different. The kids who had laughed the day before now wanted to sit next to him. One even asked if his dad had ever met an astronaut. Another asked if Jalin could bring one of his dad's space tools to class. Jalin didn't brag, didn't puff up. He just answered simply, and kept moving forward. At recess, Mila walked beside him. "They believe you now," she said. Jalin shrugged. "They didn't have to." Mila grinned. "Still nice, though." In the staff lounge, Mr. Denton sat alone for a while, then folded a note into Jalin's cubby. It wasn't typed or formal, just a folded-up sheet of paper. Jalin found it after lunch. It read, "Jalin, I was wrong. You shouldn't have had to prove anything to us. Keep dreaming big, Mr. Denton." Jalin didn't smile. He didn't read it twice. He folded it back up, slipped it into his backpack, and zipped it quietly. He hadn't needed the apology, but maybe someone else needed to write it. That afternoon, as the final bell rang, Jalin walked out of the school with his head high. Not because of what the class thought now, but because of what never changed. His dad had shown up. He was an engineer, and most importantly, he had told the truth, even when no one believed him. And somewhere, inside that classroom, a teacher had been reminded of a lesson he had forgotten. Kids carry dreams bigger than most adults' expectations. And when we dismiss those dreams, we don't just shrink their imagination, we shrink their voice. But Jalin stayed loud and clear because the truth doesn't need permission. It just needs someone brave enough to say it out loud. If you've ever been doubted, overlooked, or told to be more realistic, remember this. Other people's limits don't define your path. Keep showing up. Keep speaking your truth. And if you're ever in a position to believe in someone when nobody else will, do it. You might just change their world.